All right, I'm going to start going over some of the new changes that we have to our application. Notice in requirements, nothing has changed. We still have that from before. We have our proc file, nothing has changed from that before. And then in our app file, nothing has changed from that. Okay. We did add a new folder called blueprints. And notice in our blueprints, we have this little dot right there. That means that we added an init underscore init underscore to pi. And there's actually nothing that has to be inside that. So we just leave it blank. And the reason why we put that there is to make this folder like searchable, okay, or usable, okay. So that puts this little tiny dot here that makes this folder kind of an app, okay. We didn't do anything to static, but we did do a couple. We added two files to template. Okay, so let's talk first about the runners.py. Okay, and we'll also talk about blueprints. So a blueprint is a way for us to modulate our runners. Okay, so if we look at our routes just have the two basic routes, the index page and the about page. You might have index, about, and like your exam 1 page, right? Those are real basic pages, one line of code, not a whole lot there to it, more static pages, right? But sometimes we'll open up this runners page, and on the runners routes, we have a lot more code, okay? So there's 3 main sections of code on the runners page, okay? So what a blueprint does is it takes this runners code, stuff that's going to be in there, and it segments it out into a much more organized file that we can use, okay, called a blueprint, okay? So we would say runners, and everything that has to do with runners would go on this runners blueprint, okay? So we start by adding the word blueprint to our Flask import library. So we're importing that section of the library called blueprint. And then we need, like right here on line 4, we need to set our runners. So runners is equal to blueprint runners name, okay? And then we'll start doing our routes. And instead of going at app, like we did in routes, see it says at app, instead of that, it's going to be at runners, referencing this runner here, okay? And then we'll do our /runner. So when we go to /runner, it's going to do this first route, okay? And then the method is get and post. Now, get and post have to do with the HTML form, on how the form is the HTML page is interacting with this route, okay? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But for right now, you're going to use both of those methods, okay? Then as we come down, we have to define runners, and then we set our database connection. So the database connection is referring back to this dbconnect.py, which is our last added file that we added, okay? And then we were going to import our connection there, okay? So we're going to use our connection and import our connection. All right. So we connect to our database, and then we create what we call a database cursor, okay? The database cursor is what we'll use to interact with the database. So we connect into it, we create our cursor. Now, if the method is post, okay, if someone has hit the post on our form, on our HTML, then it says our if is to do this. If it's not post, we're going to do this, okay? So if we go to the page the first time, okay, we go to our HTML page, it's just going to run this code. But if we're on our HTML page, okay, let's go to our Flask example. So when the page first loads, that's called the get, okay, get. If I click this add runner, that will be the post, okay? So if it loads, first thing it does, it just loads the page. But when I type in the stuff into the form and I click add the runner in the form, that's when it becomes a post, okay? So if it's just a form, it says use the cursor, run a select clause on our database, and return all the runners. So it says use cursor, fetch all, put all the runners into this all runner, and then we're going to send out into our render template. We're going to send into our runners.html page the all runners all runners. So we want to send in all runners. And we're going to call that variable, that's what we're sending in is all runners. And it happens to be all runners, which is this all runners here. Okay. Let's see how that interacts with our actual template. So we're going to open up runners.html. We're going to come up here and then notice with our Django right here, it says for runner in all runners. Okay. Now this is a for loop and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But for right now, know that right here, we're going to loop through this and put all the runners into this thing. Okay. So, a couple things that you should know about is for loops. Okay. That's kind of big. For loops. Another thing that you should know about is if statements. If statements. Okay. So an if statement is pretty basic. It says if this happens, if this is true, if this method is post, run this code. Otherwise, run this code. Okay. That's an if statement. Okay. When we looked at the runners.html, this is a for statement. This is actually not Python for. This is actually just Django for. So Django for says for runner. So runner is just a variable. We could say for fish in all runners. We're going to say take whatever's inside this big variable that we sent, which remember that's being sent right here. So it takes everything. It's being sent right here. Okay. So everything that was in the database, put it into a big package and send it into all runners. And then over here, it's going to say, all right, take the runner. So take the first row in this and then get the runner ID and put it here. And then get the runner and get the first name here. So runner ID, first name and last name will match up to the column names here inside your database. Okay. So the runner is this runner here. And these variables are the variables column names inside the database. Okay. All right. Let's see what other code we have. We do have some more Django code down here. These are the form actions. What do you do if you click the button? This form here is the delete. Okay. So when you say click the button, what's it going to do? Well, it's going to call this delete runner. Okay. So remember, runners is the name of the blueprint, and it's going to find delete runner, and it's going to pass into it the runner ID. So if we come over here and go down to delete, here's our delete runner. Here's our runner ID that we're passing into it. And then when we run that database connection, it says delete from runners, which is the name of the table, where runner ID is equal to the runner ID that was passed in. And this runner ID here is the same runner ID here, which is the same runner ID here, and everything's been passed in. So it gets passed in, it deletes it, and it says, so even after it deletes it, it doesn't actually delete it until you commit it. So you've got to connect into the database, run the cursor, execute the cursor, and then commit the database. Okay. All right. So, and then it will say, are you sure you want to do it? Yes. And then it deletes it. All right. So that's the runners page. Okay. And on runners.py, we have, let's just open it up. Runners.py, we have three main routes. The first route is this route here is the add, which is this portion here, or the read. Okay. The second route is the update. Okay. So this whole route here is just used to update the runner's name. So it grabs the form, it takes the first name, the last name into the form, it updates the runners using SQL, and then notice these little variable placeholders here. This variable placeholder goes to this variable placeholder goes to this, and this variable placeholder goes to this. Okay, and then it updates successfully, and then again it refreshes the page by running it and putting it back. If it's a get or a post. I think this one, we don't have to have, this get method is used to pre-populate the form. Okay, so that makes sense. So it's just grabbing all the data and putting it back in there. Okay. All right. And then the last one is just the delete. That's the third route we're going to have on the delete. Now, in the delete, notice it also brings in the runner ID, so we'll know which one to delete. Okay, so over here in the HTML, we need to make sure we give it the runner ID. So this whole thing from here to here is a loop. Okay, that's a for loop. Okay, a Jenga for loop, which means it's getting this really big Excel table, and it wants the runner and each runner is a row, and it has an ID, a first name, and a last name. The ID, okay, is passed in here, and the ID is also passed in here for the delete. Okay, so we're passing in the IDs. Okay, and you'll notice when we pass them in, all right, let's open this up. When we pass it in, this one's actually not going to work because, let's see, this one. Notice when we pass it in, if I click update, notice it says update runner and then a 1. This 1 right here is the ID that's being passed in. Okay, that little 1 right there. Okay, I'm going to hit cancel and go back. If I hit update on the second one, it should be a 2. And then if I add a runner, it should be a 4 or a 5, whatever, however many it is. It's just a primary key. Okay, so that little thing that gets passed in to the end of the URL, that's where that's coming from. All right. On the update runner HTML, it's just one little form. Again, this is just the one div that's inside the content area, and it's basically saying, hey, use the post method, okay, and then update the first name, update the last name, and send all that information back to the form. So if you go back to runners.html, go back to runners.py, in this update part right here, notice it says get the first name and the last name from the form. Okay, from the form. All right, so that is a lot of information. So what we've covered so far is the runners.py, the update runner, the runners.html, the DB Connect. Those are all the new files. Okay, and we've showed each of those. All right. We also talked about a little bit about for loops, and we've also talked a little bit about if statements. Okay, and we'll go into a little bit more detail of those in a future video.